Hi, this is Joe, and I'm doing the response to the Ask Me Anything thread that I created on RIDW. First, I just want to say that I'm very impressed with the quality of the questions that you guys gave me. I wasn't really sure what you would ask, but I think there were some just good diversity of topics, and there was also focus on the things that I ideally would have hoped you would have asked, but didn't expect you to. Nonetheless, you did. So I'm actually pretty eager to do this and get into it and talk about, I think, some of the more positive sides of progressivism that have been lacking in most of the discussions had by the members of the intellectual dark web. All right, so I'm just going to go down the list and basically doing it in the order of the most upvoted and go on down from there. So the first one is by Rainbow Canyon. And he has two questions. The first one is, do you think the IDW's criticism for the left are fair/accurate? I would say yes. I would say that, especially since most of this has been on social issues, which the left has really gotten heavily wrong in many ways, I would say that that's... when you just look at how messed up identity politics is and how unsustainable it is over any long period of time in terms of producing a stable civic society, they've been absolutely correct to criticize it. It's such a short-sighted way of organizing and building political coalitions, and it has very little what I believe to be moral foundations. And I think I can elaborate that more on other questions that are more specific. But yes, it's fair. Now, second question by Rainbow Canyon is, with all the political talk from the IDW, why do you think they stay away from economic discussions? Do you think they should engage with it more? So, I think there's two parts of that. One is that most of what the IDW does is in reaction to the excesses of the left. And where the left has had excesses, it's mostly on social issues. So if you're talking about those, you're inherently not going to be talking about economic issues. And I think it's sort of like what Jordan Peterson says. Well, when people ask him, well, why don't you criticize the right more if you're not alt-right? And he says, well, the right didn't come after me. And it's the framing in which this is happening. So economic discussions are being overlooked more because the left isn't bringing up complaints that pertain to economic discussions as much. And they're not deplatforming people because they are against the living wage, or they're against unions, or they're against universal health care. They don't deplatform people for that. They deplatform people over something that's interpreted as being Holocaust denial, when in fact it wasn't. Or if you just look at what they did to Brett Weinstein, that's they tried to deplatform him to the point of driving him out of the university completely because of what they perceived about his statements on the day of absence. So some of it has to do with that. I think some of it has to do with the fact that there's some libertarian leanings among the IDW, a bit, not totally, but especially as far as Dave Rubin is concerned and how he tends to use his platform. And I personally think libertarians don't have strong economic arguments, and it's very easy to avoid discussions of those unless it's with someone who is going to agree with that. That's a little more speculation on my part. Now, to get to the part, do I think they should engage with economic discussions more? Yes, I think they should, because the reason why I'm a progressive is because I think economic issues are, that's area number one. And so many of the social issues that plague the concerns of social justice warriors will be difficult to solve unless we have good economic policy in place. And moreover, economic issues are inherently unifying in the way you approach them. If you're talking about creating a living wage, that helps everybody. And in a way that insofar as it appeals to what the leftists try to do, a living wage would disproportionately help people of color, women. I mean, there's a lot of single moms out there who would really do well with an increase in the minimum wage to a living wage and then having it indexed to inflation. So yeah, I think economics really needs to be discussed more because it's actually more important. It's just in the current times that we're saying it's just not sexy to discuss economics, whether you're on the right wing or the left wing. That's just not how it's been lately, and that's not how it's been for the IDW so far. And I hope that can change at some point. And then I hope folks like those who ask these questions in the sub, people like me and others can maybe help to steer it in that direction. All right, so that's Rainbow Canyon's questions. Next, Otto C. Soto asks, how do you define progressivism? And I'm glad you asked that because this is a very good foundational question, which I think is really lacking in the way the intellectual dark web, or at least certain members of it, discuss progressivism. So let me go ahead and say what progressivism is not. It is not leftism. It is not socialism. It's neither of those things. Progressivism is in fact something that doesn't really map well onto a left-right political ideology spectrum. It's more about a kind of flavor of values that you can apply to left-wing ideologies and even right-wing ideologies. It happens to be that it has had perhaps a better following among the left, but if we just look at the history of progressive politics, we see that it spans both parties, both the left and the right. So just to give some salient examples of conservative progressives, because when you say that, progressive, conservative, progressive, people double take. They don't know what you're talking about. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, two men who defined politics in the progressive era. That's the period of American politics from 1898 to 1920. And they were largely economic progressives, and which is the nucleus of what progressivism is. So I'll get more to that. But that's sort of what progressivism is anchored to. It's doing more to address the excesses of capitalism, not to get rid of capitalism, to just address some of its flaws that have a way of compounding. So when we look at the concern there is for income inequality, that was a concern in the early 20th century, and it's a concern now. And they did things to address it then, to deal with income inequality and oversized corporations. That's why we have antitrust laws. That's why we have an income tax. That's why we started regulating businesses and created federal agencies to make sure that safe products were being produced. That's why we passed laws for labor standards, getting the work week passed, getting child labor illegalized. What we're seeing with the progressive movement today, that largely correlates to the Occupy movement and then the Bernie Sanders campaign, is merely a continuation of those values on economic justice. Not so much a socialist program, but a capitalism with some tweaks to its inevitable flaws. As effective as capitalism is, there are some things it doesn't do well. Progressivism really isn't about social issues. So, I mean, if you look at progressive politics during the progressive era, it was, about, reining in the banks, which is the thing today, reining in the corporations, which is the thing today, reining in the robber barons, which we would call the 1% today. It was about getting corruption out of the government, which is another big thing today. I mean, some of the same basic issues from then are alive today in the progressive movement, and that's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about social justice warfare. That's not relevant to progressivism at all. However, I will say that there are progressives who are all about the SJW stuff. I recently wrote an article about this on Medium, in which I sort of clarify current progressivism in there's two groups. There's the classical progressives. So classical progressives are basically the people I just described. They are, at at their most fundamental, capitalists who want to prevent its excesses from harming our democracy and from sort of cannibalizing itself and leading to the kind of events that we saw in the Great Depression or the Great Recession. And they might support some social issues here and there, but they often correlate to some greater desire for improvement in innovation and ethics and scientific advancement. And that's another component of progressivism as well. It's really, I mean, if I had to get the politics out of it and I just had to describe the values that are expressed through political programs, it's about improving our ethics. It's about making politics more bottom-up or populist. And it's about innovating, and it's about using new ideas and discoveries, such as in science. And this is one area where you might say social justice warriors aren't necessarily progressive, because when the science is inconvenient, they prefer to ignore it, and that's a problem, and that's not progress. The science is what science is, and even if it has some inconvenient facts, you have to contend with it, as Peterson might say. And so classical progressives are focused largely on the economic side, the government ethics side. There's this other group who they share those concerns with the classical progressives, but then some of them have these social justice warrior concerns as well. I call them NeoProgressives because they don't really have a place in the history of progressive politics. Social justice issues were usually not at the forefront. For the NeoProgressives, social issues have more priority. So, they, like me, I'm a classical progressive. The NeoProgressives also want Medicare for all, or a single-payer healthcare system, or whatever you want to call it. They also want a living wage. They also want to repeal right-to-work laws and empower unions. They still want these things, but they're also on board with a lot of the pronoun stuff, with often identity politics and such. And that's what I would say is progressivism. It's and it has those two categories: classical progressives and neo-progressives. So Otto also asks, what is more progressive, a definition of gender that is supported by biologists/geneticists, or a definition of gender that is supported by social scientists/activists? So going back to what I said earlier about how progressivism is really trying to make use of new science to improve our systems and policies, I think the answer right there is clear. It's a definition of gender that is supported by biologists/geneticists, because social science really, like, that should have nothing to do with how we talk about gender or sex or male and female. That social science is trying to talk about aggregate behaviors. At best, you could say that maybe psychologists, as part of social science, can have some say on that. But psychologists are also, psychology is sort of an overlap between biology and social science. So even then, you're not really, it's the exception that proves the rule. Right, so science, you have to be consistent with science if you want to be progressive, in my view. And I think that really speaks to why Brett Weinstein and Heather Huiying had the experience they did with Evergreen, because they're progressives, they're even leftists, but they weren't willing to compromise scientific facts for ideology, and that was the clear difference right there. And so Otto has another follow-up question on this topic. Does my gender change fluidly in accord with my deeply felt internal states and individual experience, or is my gender in some way bounded, bimodal, by my genetics and morphology? So I think, when I say gender, because I think gender is such an incoherent and ill-defined concept, even by its most ardent and doctrinaire believers on the left, that I don't see any useful way to use it other than as a synonym for sex, which is, we're talking about a strictly biological or physiological term. So I don't think it's something that changes fluidly. I don't even know how really gender can exist as a communicable mental state. That's how poorly defined I think it is. So no, I don't think it changes fluidly. I think attitudes can change. How you feel about whether you're male or female can change. Is that the same as whether you're male or female being the thing that changes? I don't think so. And it's sort of like, it sort of just goes back to what Eric Weinstein said in one episode of the Rubin Report, where he says, are trans women women just as much as biological women? He says that's not true, and I think that sort of gets at what I believe as well. It's just there's no practical way for gender to be fluid that I can see, especially in terms of something that you can advocate, and you can expect people to listen to and follow and respect. I think that's one thing that the left often really overlooks is how poorly they communicate some of their ideas to the rest of the world, only to be surprised that not everyone is on board right away. And it's not so much because they have hatred for the group in question, it's just because they don't know what you're talking about. And how do you spread those ideas if you can't make people understand them? That's one thing I think that the left really have to work on before we move forward. Anyway, that's Otto's questions. Moving along, TrippHooray asks, what are your thoughts on UBI as it compares to welfare? And I asked him to elaborate on that, and he said standard components of current U.S. welfare, TANF, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security insurance, etc. So, as it compares to welfare, in many of the effects it would have, it wouldn't be too different. You have to look at things like Social Security or food stamps or Medicaid as subsidies to demand in the economy. So, it's something that helps support spending, that allows our economy to function better. It gives businesses more clients, because money that people don't have to spend on health care because they have Medicaid is money they can spend on something else. UBI is essentially saying, well, here's more money you can spend, and that's kind of the idea. It's trying to keep most of the proponents for it are saying automation is coming in. We need to keep a consumer base active, as people are going to lose a lot of jobs. So this is one way to do it. And I think one of the advantages of UBI is it applies to everyone because it's universal. And it's a little more, so that allows it to be more. I'm not saying it's like it's better because that makes it more fair. I'm saying because I think if you qualify for Medicare or Medicaid, because you're old or you're poor, that means it's fair if you get support for that. I think what's better about something universal, though, is that it allows more of our subsidy to demand to be, I think, influenced by market forces. People can spend that money on businesses and products and ideas that they find valuable, and that can sort of feed into the next generation of entrepreneurial initiatives in America, especially as we're phasing into a more automated economy. So I think that's one advantage it has. It'll provide some of that necessary cash to fund those efforts. Another advantage is that it has perhaps less overhead in its execution, because all you really have to do is issue a check. You don't need a lot of clerks for that, whereas with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, you have to apply for it, and there's people will do deductions from your income, depending on what the specifics are, and that's not a consideration for UBI. UBI is like, this is what you get, and everything else is extra on top of that. Whether you work or you have your own business or something. So it's similar in that it's a subsidy to demand, and it's a cost on. It's an item on the public budget, but it has, I think, some greater advantages in that it's a cheaper form of demand subsidy, and it's probably injecting more liquidity into the economy. Let's see. Next, we have from Podesta Password. He says, how much of citizens' income do you think the government has the right to? Okay, that's kind of an odd question. I don't know that there's really a direct or specific answer I can give to that, because I don't believe in a very specific tax rate at any given moment. I think our taxing and spending policies should be flexible depending on needs and trends in the business cycle and the evolution of our society. I think, generally speaking, we should tax as little as necessary to have a healthy, vibrant system. And what's as little as necessary, might seem high in some contexts, right? So let's assume that we need to tax a lot, all right? As little as necessary might be 90%. In a certain context. And that seems like a lot, but it's not 95, right? In another context, as little as necessary could be 20%. And then a lot of that really depends on, I think, how flat the income distribution of the economy is. So if you look at Scandinavian nations, they tax at higher income rates, but there's less of a difference between what your income tax rate is, whether you're on the lower end of income or on the higher end. It's a flatter system, but income distribution is also flatter there. So maybe that works because the tax system reflects the earning power of the people. Here in the United States, there's so much income inequality, I don't know if that would really work. You probably have to tax the upper classes more heavily than the lower classes, at least for a time, until the income distribution got flatter. Not flat per se. We don't want to make it flat. We don't want to go, full Marxist or anything, because as plenty of people in the intellectual dark web point out, you need some inequality to provide incentive, to allow for efficiencies to take root. The real issue is just too much, and then the tax system has, I think, to reflect what the earning power of the citizens are, and if it's not flat like it is in the United States, then our income tax distribution should be similarly not flat and it should match, I think, what the earning power is. So if we're able to flatten it in the United States, the income tax rate should adjust. People on the lower end should pay more, and people on the higher end should maybe pay less. And truthfully, though, income tax system isn't the best. Going back to a lot of these Scandinavian countries, they use the value-added tax system, and that is arguably better in many ways. That's how Andrew Yang proposes to fund UBI. So, maybe just to pull it away from income taxes, we might look at other methods of taxation. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. I believe you have another. Yeah, you did a second one. Podesta did a second one in another post. He said, do you support borrowing money from unborn children to buy votes in the present? If so, how do you justify that? If not, how will you pay for all the free stuff on the Progressive platform? Okay, so I think that's kind of an oddly phrased question. Borrowing money from unborn children, not technically possible to do that because they don't have money. I think you're just talking about the fact that debt that the United States takes on today is going to be paid off in some form or another by future generations. So do I support financing public programs through loans, through the sale of treasury bonds? Sure, because it's a source of revenue for these programs, and traditionally we've been able to pay the interest on these bonds with little trouble. That's why we've enjoyed such a strong credit rating for so long. Our GDP growth has generally been at such a level that it's worth the cost of the interest. And you kind of just have to look at it like from a business perspective. If you borrow $1,000 to use as capital, but you can turn that into $5,000 in revenue that you wouldn't have been able to produce without the loan, then it makes sense to take on that loan. And as long as you can sustain that, it makes sense to keep on taking loans. And I think the United States has that kind of track record. And there's not much evidence to suggest that it's going to struggle with that. So that's one side of it. And another side is that unlike what any individual or business might do in terms of taking on debt, is the United States government has the power to control the currency that it takes out loans on. And so it has options in the back room that it can employ if it ever got into trouble. I mean, it can do things to control the money supply and influence interest rates such that we don't have a major financial crisis, which is not true of other entities. And in fact, that's part of what's being done with the sale of bonds, is that they're, in addition to providing essentially capital for our public programs to grow our economy, they're also a way for us to control our money supply. Because when we talk about like the money supply of the U.S. dollar, it's basically the world currency. And it's not just the dollars that are in the U.S. economy. I mean, other countries, the ones that take on, that give us those loans, they have our dollars in reserve. So, and there's a supply and demand factor there. And a lot of what taking on debt allows us to do is influence what that money supply is and what the value of the dollar is, and the benefits of how we want to manipulate it in terms of how they relate to international trade. So, there's the traditional way that we benefit from debt, and then there's the rather non-traditional ways that don't apply to other entities. And I think so far both of those have been just fine for us, and they haven't posed any problems. And I'm open to evidence to the contrary, but I'm not aware of any. So that's really how I justify it. Given that, how to pay for all the free stuff on the Progressive platform, and I assume you're talking about universal health care, tuition-free college, possibly UBI as well. There's a number of ways to do that. I think, again, a value-added tax would be a good way to pay for something like UBI. I think maybe a sort of standard income tax for healthcare might be good. I mean, healthcare is something where everyone really needs to be able to pay into it, especially people who are working. At least in my view. I think. Bernie Sanders had a great idea to pay for tuition college, is just put a tax on stock speculation, because that would either discourage it, because stock speculation is definitive rent-seeking behavior. So it would either discourage it, or it would, produce a lot of revenue for us. There's a lot of ways to do it. I think the bottom line is whatever method we do, there's a lot of liquid assets available in the American economy to fund these things, and they would provide us more long-term stability due to the improvement in our labor force that comes with funding education, with keeping them healthy, with keeping their households together. These are people that would be able to consistently hold down a job better, work for longer periods of their lives, work with higher quality due to the decreased stress and everything that comes along with that. There's several studies that sort of speak to that, and I think the data are clear that these things would magnify our ability to be a growing nation economically. It's not necessarily the sexiest quarterly report that you're going to get, but I think that's something that it's sort of like going back to what Peterson says about delaying gratification. I think we have a problem where we try to squeeze so much out of a market, and when I say we, I'm talking about just the business minds of our country, that we don't really think about what's a good 5 or 10 year plan for a business, and when these run into problems, inevitable problems, we're not able to deal with them. I think a lot of these programs on the Progressive platform give us more long-term stability and less likelihood of a depression, which is bad for everybody. And if I'm an investor, if I'm more interested in what the long-term steady payout is going to be, so that I have a retirement, to be quite frank. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Let's see. There's a question from Beelzebub's Avocado. He says, where would you draw the line between legit advocacy for a minority group versus counterproductive identity politics, if you do? And he has a couple others, but I'll get to that one first. So I think legitimate advocacy for a minority group is the ability to say, this is true of a group, let's say African Americans. This problem is true of African Americans generally. Let's put out a general policy to try and help them. So I'm actually sort of open to the possibility of reparations to African Americans. And basically, maybe sort of like a UBI for them would be the way to do it, or something. Of course, there are problems with that. I talked to a good friend of mine. He himself is African American. I asked him, well, what do you think of like a UBI as a form of reparations? And he said, well, I like it. I'd like to get that. I think, it'd be fair. But I know there are people who would waste that money on drink and drugs and stuff, and I wouldn't want that. So there could be a layered approach to it. It could be in part UBI. It could be in part subsidies to education, retraining. I'm not here to put out a whole reparations program, but that's an idea. So it's something. So I think it's something that's beneficial to a group without being harmful to another. Now, what we look at with, say, a lot of identity politics is, in order to help this group that has this problem, we're going to inflict damage on this other group that we put in the category of being powerful. Usually this has been white Americans, and lately it seems like they're counting Asian Americans in that as well. I don't think that's useful, because what ends up happening is then we are discriminating against individuals, and what we have to do is parse aggregate circumstances from individual circumstances. And I think identity politics fails to do that. I think we can do that with positive programs. So one way that I would fund reparations, if we were to do that, is don't tax on any specific race and ignore their circumstances. Say, hey, if maybe there's a certain tax that's put on you if you fall into a certain income bracket to the reparations fund. And if you make this much, you're paying some of that tax. And the logic being there is that you're simply benefiting from the wealth of our nation, which was founded upon, let's say, the exploitative labor of African Americans for 3 or 4 centuries. And I think that's a good way to do it, because it doesn't ignore individual circumstances. And I think that's the where the line is drawn is, do you ignore individual circumstances or not? Identity politics always ignores individual circumstances. And that's the line right there. So Beelzebub also asked, do you think it is more important to fire up the base and turn out unlikely voters, or appeal to independents, or is it possible to do both? So what you're talking about is the difference between a blue ocean strategy and a red ocean strategy. So just to sort of define it to people, a blue ocean strategy is about capturing the greater share, and this is a business term, capturing a greater share of a market by bringing in new customers. A red ocean strategy is about trying to capture a greater market share by taking clients from your competition. So firing up the base and turning out unlikely voters is sort of that, and appealing to independence is sort of like more of a red ocean strategy. I think it's possible to do both. What we found, however, is based on research, is that even people who say they're independent or they don't like either party, a lot of them tend to vote one way, and a lot of the ones who do vote consistently tend to be pretty loyal to one party or another, even if they say they hate the Democrats. Chances are, if they voted for a Democrat once, they're voting for a Democrat almost every single time. So I think when you talk about the base, you're not just talking about party members so much, but you are talking about a lot of those independents. And I think you do want to motivate them, because I think really what explains Trump's victory is the Democrats failed to turn out their base properly. I mean, there's no way the Rust Belt states should have fallen to Trump in the way that they did. Those are supposed to be blue strongholds, and some of that is votes being captured from Obama by Trump, but a lot more of it was just Obama voters not going to the polls on Election Day. And I think that's area number one. The thing is, there's a lot less people in the middle to nab in order to win than there used to be, because of how much polarization has taken hold, to the point that even if you're an independent, you have a side. And I know there are some of you who are listening who that doesn't describe you. But that's the aggregate picture we have, is that most people are either on one side or the other. And you just have to motivate people who've committed to a side to come out and vote. And that's how you win. And that's just the basic science of it. So it's possible to do both, but really, priority number one is getting your base out. And that does include independents to an extent. Like, I live in Orange County, North Carolina. It's considered one of the bluest counties in the state. This is a state that's sort of 50-50 Democrat, Republican in the way the votes go. But Democrats win here often with 70 to 80% of the vote. However, a majority of the voters here are not Democrats. In fact, I think slightly more of them are independents than are Democrats. I mean, there's almost no Republicans, but I think the biggest group of registered voters in Orange County are independents. But they vote for Democrats, and they probably will almost always do that. So there's that. See, your next question is, what do you think of the recent focus of anti-corruption campaigning by Dems? I think that's good. I mean, anti-corruption is an essential part of progressivism, and I think one of the big lessons of the defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016 was that corruption is not going to be tolerated. Now, it's conveniently overlooked when Trump does corrupt things, but part of why the Democratic base didn't turn out in 2016 is because they saw the corruption of Hillary Clinton and they said, I can't stomach this. And so they didn't come out to vote. They looked at what happened in the primaries, the way the DNC favored Hillary's campaign over Bernie's. And they said, this is not how it's supposed to be, and you've lost my vote in November. And that happened in enough places that Trump was able to turn some blue states red. So I think focusing on that is good, but I don't think there's really been a major focus on that. And maybe you think there is, but truth be told, I see a lot of patience for business as usual politics in the Democratic Party at the federal level, but even at the local level where I'm active. And that's a disappointment for me. And I'm afraid that any gains we make in the next 2 to 4 years are going to be a result of simply backlash to Trump's agenda, not so much because we've developed our own internal long-term capabilities. And those are what we need to develop, because we have seen that as soon as we lose the office, any reforms we pass will just get torn to tatters by the Republicans. So we need the ability to hold power in the long term. And I don't think the Democrats currently are adequately addressing that. So that's my take on the anti-corruption campaigning by Dems. Next, a guy named CRISPR-Cas9. He says, as a fellow progressive Dem-ish type person, I have been cautiously optimistic about Justice Democrats like Ocasio-Cortez. After going on some deep dives, listening to IDW podcasters, I have become exposed to the alternative ideas they espouse, though I feel that some social Dem ideas have merit and defenders are largely absent in the IDW. What are your thoughts about the Justice Democrats? Would you align yourself with them, and do you feel they can actually maintain their outsider status, i.e. avoiding big money contributions? So I've not really been a big follower of Justice Democrats. I don't have too much to say on them, but I'll try as best as I can to answer your question. For one, I think most of their key platform items are great. I mean, they're very consistent with progressivism, and they're just line for line almost every key initiative you'd want to see on a progressive platform. You know, with stuff pertaining to unions, to wages, to universal health care, to college, to getting money out of politics. That's on there, and it's not so much SJW stuff, so that's assuring. I do have concerns about it. I mean, just because Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks was a founding member of that, he since has been forced to resign because of controversial statements he made. So he's not like an influence in that. But you know, I have my concerns with Cenk, and I just wonder how much there are people who might have the similar problems that I see in him in Justice Democrats. So far, I don't know very many. I suspect that when I eventually do run for office again, I'll find an ally in the Justice Democrats. So for now, it's good. But I would say I'm similarly cautiously optimistic about Ocasio-Cortez. I share that. And I do think that it's possible to maintain an outsider status and avoid big money contributions. But that means you have to be extra diligent in how you're going to raise money, because you do need funds to run a campaign. I mean, I can just tell you that there's a difference between a volunteer activist and a professional activist, and you do get what you pay for. And you know, as much as people say they hate money being involved in politics, they let the campaign with the most money influence them almost every time. Liberals say they hate it. Conservatives say they hate it. But they allow it to work. And so, you know, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do, avoiding big money contributions. And that might mean, you know, doing a lot of cheap stuff, but it means also that you're going to have to get a lot of funds, smaller funds, from a lot of people in order to be minimally competitive. So there's that. You can't really take these races for granted. So Cod Heaven, the moderator of our IDW, asks me, how do you keep the murderous ideologies from the left, like communism, from infecting the system in place? Considering how prevalent it is in academia, and it seems to be infecting places like the New York Times, how does the party differentiate itself from anti-liberal values like Marxism? Well, I think one thing that sort of does that anyway is the Democratic Party is unabashedly capitalist. And progressivism is capitalist too, but just not unabashedly. So a lot of Democrats have no trouble getting that corporate PAC money for their races, or getting individual donations from wealthy players in the corporate world. And they support laws that help corporate America at the expense of working America or minority America, you know, or the rest of the world outside of America. And so as long as there's that amount of clout in the Democratic Party, something like communism, Marxism, or whatever you want to call it, isn't going to take root in the party. Money is still very influential. And among, I think, among a lot of the social justice warrior types, and this is where a lot of people who seem progressive aren't, is that they're forming a happy alliance with corporate America. So let's look at something that happened recently, is Nike siding with Colin Kaepernick on the whole NFL take a knee stuff, right? They're using him as basically like a spokesman now. And is that really because Nike cares about the issues at stake, about criminal justice or racial justice? No, they've done a calculation. They've determined there's a money making opportunity in supporting Kaepernick, and when we go beyond that, just the general trend, when you look at how social justice warriors, when they try to deplatform people, get people fired, destroy their livelihoods, they're essentially using a lot of this, corporate activism as a means of changing society. And honestly, that just seemed outright fascist to me. If you want corporations to be the source of change in America, and these are not entities that ever care, except with very rare exceptions, about what's good for society. They just care about making money. That's the only reason they exist. They're not in this to help you out or do minorities or marginalized groups any favors. They are in it for the money. And when you let them be the standard bearers of these movements, that's a dangerous precedent. And this is where I think a lot of people who are often considered progressives and might consider them progressive are not. Because if you essentially want to weaponize the cutthroat corporatist world in which we live, if you want to weaponize things like income inequality, that people have to be afraid for their livelihoods over the slightest remark that could be blown out of proportion and turn into a witch hunt, then you're not progressive. Like, if you're really progressive, you will look at someone who is a racist asshole and say, okay, I disagree with you, but I'm not going to destroy your ability to achieve subsistence over this. Like, there's nothing progressive. If you hate the fact that labor is exploited, that the gains of our economic growth over the last 30, 40 years have gone to the top 20% so heavily, and in many ways just to the top 1% so heavily. If that bothers you, if you are outraged by the injustice of that, by the inefficiency of that, then there's the current thing that social justice warriors do just has no place. And so I think as long as social justice warriors are willing to make bedfellows with corporate America like that, then communism isn't going to take root. It's not going to become prevalent in the Democratic Party. Now, identity politics might. The cultural Marxism of a lot of this might. I don't think literal Marxism is something that's really ever going to take hold here, because the right and in many ways the left in America have made their peace with corporate power, and I think that's a problem in itself, and I think that's in many ways the real threat. What are we going to do about not staving off communism, it's staving off plutocracy? And I think that's the appropriate question to ask. And I think that's one that's, overlooked by the IDW, but as I stated before, for understandable reasons. All right, so I'll move on. Let's see. Okay, so Tempest Truth asks, do you think, considering that both Republicans and Democrats have proven themselves completely incapable of balancing the budget, the United States has a chance to avoid a fiscal disaster? Or is it now almost an inevitability that the United States budget crisis, compounded by the Japanese budget crisis, will come about in the next 10 to 20 years? So I think I addressed some of that earlier. I think what you described is not a real danger. I think it's fictitious. I think it's a narrative that's largely been cooked up by the rent-sinking elites, and I'm just saying that to use some common IDW terminology, on the right or among the libertarian camp, who just want to make an excuse to cut spending and pay less taxes. And rarely does this actually result in reducing our actual deficit spending or our borrowing. Like I said before, we've had a very solid history of being able to pay off our loans and take on new debt to finance more growth, and it's been a pretty steady cycle. And while there are changes at work at all times, such as with a growing share of the American economy or the American society being aged and non-working. The proportion of youth to retired, is leaning more toward the retired side. We're not really at a point where that's an issue, and I think, given that the dollar is essentially a world currency, and I think it's unlikely that other countries would continue to trade with us or issue debt to us in a way that they thought we wouldn't be able to handle it. I think, and then of course we can always just manipulate our currency since we own it and control the interest rates, control the money supply so that we can pay off our debts and be solvent. It might not be the prettiest or neatest way to do it, but I really don't believe it'll ever come anything close to an actual crisis because we just have no history of that. The only way we would have a crisis is if people who insist on austerity had control of the government at the time that we were in crisis mode and then just let the disaster go unchecked. But this talk of balancing the budget it's not a useful talk at this moment. Balancing the budget is only meaningful if a balanced budget still subsidizes enough spending in the economy such that growth can continue to occur. So if we look at a country like Germany, they're able to have budget surpluses because the nature of their economy allows them to have the kind of revenues they need to balance their budget and support the spending that they need. But if we look at the American economy, deficit spending is really the way we do things. From about 2009 to 2015, the growth in that period, about 83% of that was from household spending. You take away that spending, you take away the growth. And that's why we need these public programs to inject liquidity into the economy, to subsidize demand, and to keep the spending going, to keep the growth going. I think that's where we would actually run into a crisis, is if we tried to balance the budgets inaccurately and inappropriately and stop our growth, well then we'd have even bigger financial problems at that point. That would be just like turning off like building a dam on the money river, and it just stops flowing, and for no reason other than to build a dam. And again, I'm open to whatever might happen to change that situation, but as the circumstances currently stand, that is just not an issue. So I will move on. So Casey Squared asked two questions. One, did you really think that you could flip a district from deep red to deep blue? Wouldn't a conservative Dem have a better chance in a district with such a conservative constituency? I assume you're talking about my House district in which I ran in 2016. So for those of you who didn't see my original post, I just mentioned that I ran for the North Carolina House of Representatives in 2016 as the Democratic nominee there. And so it wasn't a very big place. It's not a congressional district. This is a state legislative race. And so there's 120 of those in my state. And I ran for the one where my hometown was. And for one, that's not a deep red district. In fact, of the 120 districts for the state house, all of which are gerrymandered to help the Republicans achieve a supermajority, House District 2, that's mine, even with the redrawn borders that the courts ordered within the last 2 years, House District 2 is one of the most competitive in the state. Might even be the most competitive. It was R+0. I don't think there was any other House District like that. Now, it does have conservative leanings, but if you look at, say, Person County and how it voted that same year for state senate, Mike Woodard was the state senate candidate. He won a majority of Person County. And Person County is the only county that is completely subsumed within House District 2. There's a county next to Person just east of it called Granville County, and it has like the southern half of the county, and it's the more Republican part. But Person County, which usually goes red, I mean, it's gone to every Republican presidential candidate. Mike Woodard has won that every single time he's run for state senate, and he doesn't even need to win Person, because he has a lot of Durham County, which is more urban, and there's a lot of African-American votes there and young progressive votes. He still wins Person County. He's done it ever since he's run for his district in 2012. And then if you look at House District 2 in 2012, Winky Wilkins won that district. Not just Person County, he won the district because, and he was a Democrat, and he ran with the borders as I had them, and they're not very different from how they've been redrawn. It's one of the least affected districts by the court-ordered redistricting. And he won because there are two things he had that I didn't. He had name recognition because he's older, he's been around the block longer, and he had better access to fundraising. Those are two things that I didn't have, and that's a hurdle for every new candidate, and it's one of the reasons why you see less young people in elected office. It's just you get your donors by being involved a long time in meeting folks and getting a list of friends that you can call on. And Democrats like Winky had that. He had the advantage of incumbency as well. So I see what you mean. Can you turn a district from deep red to deep blue? Generally, no. My district just wasn't deep red. It's light red at best, really light red. And the Democrat running there could very well win this year, especially if there is a blue wave coming. Your second question is, in your opinion, how did the GOP win control of the North Carolina General Assembly in 2010? So North Carolina General Assembly is what we basically call our state version of the Congress. The General Assembly consists of both our state House of Representatives and our state Senate. And in 2010, the Republicans won control of that. And currently, they have a supermajority in both houses, which means when we say supermajority, that's an informal term to refer to the fact that they can override the veto of the governor. And our current governor is a Democrat, so he has basically no veto power because they will override any veto he does. And they have done that multiple times already. So as to why they won control in 2010, there are two things. One, there was the Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement was in part the conservative frustration over the bank bailouts, and they just seemed to blame the Democrats for that. It was in part frustration over corruption in politics, and they blamed the Democrats for that. And I'm not saying there isn't blame for Democrats on the problems with those things. It's just there's bipartisan fault there. And then the third thing was just they could not handle Obama, and I think it was a race issue. And I know that might be an unpopular opinion here, but I saw angry Tea Partiers in December 2008, just electrifying the media when Obama hadn't even taken office yet, and they were furious at him. And it's hard to explain that as something other than they just can't handle the fact that a black man won president. And that's the most SJW thing you will ever hear me say. Probably the only thing, too. So some of it's that. So, in other words, the Republican base turned out more, going back to that previous question. Another thing is that while the Democrats had also gerrymandered the districts here in North Carolina, based on the maps they drew from the 2000 census, one thing is that technology was more limited at the time, and they weren't able to use the computer software that we have now to draw really ideal districts, which is what has allowed the Republicans to get their supermajority. They've just drawn the maps the ideal way. Democrats did not have the technological capability to do that. And also, it was the end of the decade, so the maps were a bit obsolete. So there was sort of a weak point where enough Republican turnout could change that result, and that's what happened. And it was definitely a matter of the technology, because I asked a member of the State House, who is still in, and she was in the State House during the 2000 census gerrymander. I asked her, why didn't we gerrymander more perfectly ourselves? I was not saying that's what she should have done. I'm just asking, why didn't it occur? And she straight up told me it wasn't for lack of will, it was for lack of means, because of how primitive the software for doing such at the time was. That's how the GOP won control of the General Assembly. The Bridge is Broken asks, how many sexes are there? Do you believe that the president is a Russian agent? Should we treat people differently based on the color of their skin? Do you wish to abolish ICE? Should firearms be banned? Should speech be censored? Well, that's a bunch. First thing, how many sexes are there? 2, male and female. That's really all there is to it. It's not like the human species exists on a sexual spectrum. We're a species of 2 sexes. There are, of course, outliers in the data. People are born with ambiguous genitalia and ambiguous phenotypes. And I kind of look at it like this. Imagine 2 bars on a graph, and you have to get to a certain height to be considered a sex, whether male or female. So let's say this hand is the male bar and this hand is the female bar. So if you have enough qualities on this and you get to let's say my eye level, you're now at you've attained sex status and you're male, right? And usually what happens is, as the phenotypical ambiguities take place, is you lose characteristics and gain them at the expense of another. So as a phenotype becomes more female, it reaches the adequate level, it loses the male traits, gains the female one, so that it's a reproducing individual in the species. If you have ambiguous genitalia, you can't produce gametes because you have elements of both sexes, but not enough for a complete set. Then, in my view, you're not exactly a sex. That's how I would look at it, and I don't know what biologists would say, but that's my view. This isn't denying that intersex people exist. It's simply, I think, trying to precisely determine what it is to have a sex. So that's my answer. Do you believe that the president is a Russian agent? It depends on what you mean by that. I don't think he is a conscious pawn of Putin. He might be a useful idiot in some ways. It's possible that there's some elements of coercion and blackmail at work here. Trump is definitely friendlier with Putin than he ought to be, and that's a concern. I think he's conveniently overlooking the effect Russia had on our election, which I believe to be illegal, and a threat to our national security. I think he's deliberately overlooking that just because it happened to help him win. So it really depends on what you mean by Russian agent. Some people use that as a term of a conscious supporter. Some people say that a Russian agent is someone who is being tricked into helping Russia. It's possible that he's being tricked. I don't think he's knowingly betraying America for the sake of Russia or Putin, however. Should we treat people differently based on the color of their skin? No. Shouldn't. Like I said, there may be things we can do at the aggregate to address some of the woes and mistakes of the past, but individuals should be treated as individuals, first and foremost. And that's paramount in any functioning moral society. I don't wish to abolish ICE. I think there are definitely some reforms that could be made. The current mode of operation is not really what I would consider proper or fair or just. I don't know that warrants scrapping the whole agency altogether. I think it exists for a reason. We do need to have some sort of border enforcement. How we approach that is maybe something that we need to re-examine. I'm really not totally settled on what immigration policy should be. It's not an issue I think that has been very well discussed by either side. I think it's something that has been useful for rabble rousing for either voting base, but as far as what actually works, that's sort of up in the air. If it could be shown to me that ICE was an inherently useless, wasteful, or unethical use of taxpayer dollars, then maybe we could abolish it. But if there's things that ICE did well in the past, and we're just scared of it now because Trump is using it like never before, I don't know if that's necessarily a good reason to abolish ICE. Nobody wanted to abolish it until Trump got it. I think that's a bit odd that they want to now. firearms should not be banned, at least not within the current status of the law, which is the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Firearms are a right. If you want to ban them, you have to talk about repealing the Constitution. Democrats don't want to have the conversation, which I think is, frankly, just not very honest or insightful of them. It's not really clear to me what amending the Constitution to repeal the Second Amendment would accomplish for us. And it's not clear to me that banning guns would necessarily solve a lot of the problems we're seeing. I think a lot of the murders that we see are socioeconomic in their origin. If we simply did more to improve or reduce the amount of poverty in this country through the economic programs that fall under the progressive umbrella, we would see a lot of gun violence go down. I think we should try that first before we talk about taking away people's guns. At the end of the day, it's a right it's a right with just as much weight as free speech, freedom of religion, or the right to an attorney. So we should just accept it for what it is for now, I think. I'm not a big fan of guns myself. I'm not a hater of guns. It's another issue where I'm a bit ambivalent. I don't think it's an issue that is well discussed by either the Democrats or the Republicans. I think it's just a rabble-rousing issue. And should speech be censored? Not by the government. I think, of course, private entities have a right to do that. Now, when we say should, does that mean private entities should do that? If you have the right to do something, does that mean you should exercise that right at all moments? I don't think so. I think, for example, when the NFL started issuing fines for people who kneel during the pledge, I don't think they should do that. I think they have a right to do that. I'm not going to make them stop, but I don't think they should. I think if you really value the customs and ways of American society, that's not something that you would see fit to do. And I think that's just something that that's a decision we have to make as individuals. It's a personal moral decision. So it should not be censored in a public sense, and in many cases, free speech should also not be censored in a private sense. But people should have the ability to make that distinction. I just wish more people would make the right distinction about what speech should be censored or not when in private scenarios. What's next? Missy95448 asks, can you clarify that differences between the ideas of progressivism, communism, and socialism, where the Democratic Party falls vis-a-vis each? I think I did sort of clarify that a bit earlier, but this is a more precise question, so I'll answer more precisely. As I said, progressivism isn't necessarily a left-right thing, right? So we saw conservative progressives or right-leaning progressives in characters such as Theodore Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan. You might even say Howard Taft. But I don't know why you would say Howard Taft. Communism is explicitly left-wing ideology. It's as far left as you can go, in fact. And then socialism might be considered a broader umbrella term that includes communism at its most extreme. So communism is really like a fully reimagined state of society. Socialism is less thorough, I guess. It really, these words are often thrown around a lot. So, I mean, you could argue in some way that America has, even though it has capitalism, it also has socialism, right? There's a federal post office, socialized mail delivery, the police forces, military, publicly owned and run. So, socialized in that sense. So progressivism is, I think within American use, and this is what we should think of progressivism as when we're talking about political issues, is we're talking about social democracy, basically a democratic political system, a capitalist economic system, where the democratic system has priority over the capitalist system. So you rein in capitalism to keep it from having excesses that hurt the general welfare of the people. But otherwise, it's your go-to thing. You let the free market handle as much as you can until it becomes clear that it's a bad idea, or that it's not going to do certain things. So There's another Medium article I wrote called Government is Part of the Market. And basically I argue, and Eric Weinstein sort of addressed this idea in a Rubin interview once, that there's this thing called collective demand. And we usually think of demand as being sort of, just a force within a private market of individuals or maybe collections of individuals, but not society. So there are things that are needed at the collective level, and this is why I don't see myself as a collectivist or an individualist. I see that there's a need for both. Is that there's just some things that society as a whole needs that the market just won't be able to address because individuals are they have too many blind spots to organize effectively toward that goal. So you need government to come in and provide the funds and the demand for that. And sometimes that means they actually provide the service. Sometimes it means they're going to be the ones who contract to government, to firms that will provide that service. So an example, of course, is the military. We need safety. And let's add the police to that as well. Police is domestic, military is more foreign and international. Right? We need safety. For anything to function, we need to be able to go outside and not be abducted or murdered or robbed. And military and police allow us to have that kind of life. And that's not something that any private entity could handle. Because there's the moral hazard issue, right? If all the states in America on the border pay their safety bill to the private military, then the countries in the middle of America don't have to pay anything because you can't get invaded if the other states are paying that. But then military is probably going to be underfunded. So you need a government that just makes all of society absorb the cost, regardless of how interior or safe they are relative to other places, so that it's adequately funded. And then there are other issues. So, let's say, places are getting invaded, but it's an area where the people didn't pay their safety bill to the private military. Well, they'd say, oh, well, we're not going to cover that. And that's no way to do national defense. Let people get into the country based on who paid for it. Or just imagine if the fire department operated like that. Oh, your house is burning down? Where's your address? Oh, you guys didn't pay your fire bill, so we just have to let your house burn down. This is a unstable world to live in. So there are some things that the government has to do. I think progressivism acknowledges that, and maybe communism acknowledges that as well. What communism fails to do is acknowledge what the limits are and how much the market can still do things. I think progressivism does acknowledge that, and I think that's why it's a useful, positive force. A lot of people don't see a difference between progressivism and communism when they look at the cultural Marxism of the left. They see a lot of those people calling themselves progressives. That's what they think progressivism is, but that's just not the case. It wasn't the case from 1898 to 1920. It wasn't the case during the New Deal era of FDR and Truman and other Democrats. These were about fixes to our socioeconomic system, to our capitalist system, that didn't compromise our fundamental capitalist structure. And I think that's what the difference is there. Also, communism isn't necessarily intellectual, but progressivism is. Progressivism is about innovation and new ideas, and there's to an extent a science behind the successes of capitalist economies. All right, there's data that we can measure, patterns that we can observe, and communism doesn't care about that. And it will. I mean, if we look at why the Cold War was won by the West, it's because, really, in a scientific sense, communism could not fund it. So I think those are what the differences are, and I think the Democrats, they're not really progressive, but they're even less communist or socialist than they are progressive. And I think that's kind of what's going to be the case. As I mentioned before, I think while they do a lot of the identity politics stuff, they're also still at their core very corporatist. And that's true for Democrats who don't do identity politics and for Democrats who do identity politics. And often, I think identity politics is just sort of used as a cover for abusive corporatist practices. So I hope that answers your question, Missy. Let's see, what else? Let's see. Had I Dwan asks, have you ever heard of Georgism? So I did look that up in advance, and it's an idea that we tax based on like the land of the nation or something. I never really heard of it. Don't really know about it. Nothing about it really jumps out to me as, I don't know, brilliant or transformative. And yeah, so I hadn't really heard of it until you asked. And that's, I don't know if you want any other comments. You only asked if I'd heard of it. That's what I have to say. And so anyway, that concludes my my questions as I'm reading them. So I thank you guys for asking. They were very thorough, thoughtful, pensive questions, and they were things I think I was able to elaborate on pretty well, clear up a lot of points I wanted to clear up, and I think they were pretty much all answered in good faith. So I thank you for that, and I look forward to doing stuff like that again. And really what I want to do is more education like this on progressive issues, because there are so many misconceptions. Like Dave Rubin, I really don't think understands what progressivism is. I think there's a lot of stuff that he doesn't understand as well as he thinks he does, and progressivism is one of those. Not that I don't like Rubin. I mean, I have my criticisms, but I'm okay with him, and he provides something useful to public discourse that most people in the media are not willing to do. But there's a lot of, I don't think necessarily deliberate, but misinformation about progressivism that gets disseminated through members of the IDW, largely Rubin. And I hope this is an opportunity to clear that up. I'd like to do more education on this in the future. I have a Patreon page, so please support me there so I can continue to do stuff like this to spread knowledge about positive progressivism, not this dark, divisive, hostile stuff we've seen by social justice warriors. That is not progressivism. That's not what Bernie Sanders ran on. That's not what FDR ran on. That's not what Theodore Roosevelt ran on. I'm talking about inclusive, non-identitarian policies and initiatives. So you can support me on Patreon in the link in the video description. If you're interested in reading more of my Medium articles where I elaborate on some of the ideas I discussed here and continually write, you can see that in the link for that in the video description as well. But I thank you guys for giving me these questions, giving me your attention and your time, and I'll see you in our IDW posting along. All right?